In homage to Josh Taylor's fantastic performance at the weekend in becoming the undisputed lightweight champion of the world, today's presentation is going to be on improving repeated sprint ability for boxing. We're going to talk about how you can design your conditioning to improve your punch output. We're going to explain where so many boxers and coaches go wrong in trying to do this, and we're going to unpick the underpinning contributing factors that enable a boxer to punch harder for longer and to maintain their punch output throughout the rounds. And finally, we're going to end with a sample program which is going to bring together the underlying physiological mechanisms that we're going to discuss. So what is repeated sprint ability? I'm always intrigued by the question, if boxing was an athletics event, which one would it be? And for me, it would be 400 meters, some boxers more like 800 meters. But the reality is it couldn't be a short sprint like 100 or a 200, because although that's highly explosive and you do get boxers that might look like that, the reality is if you're fighting 12 3-minute rounds or indeed 3 3-minute rounds, then you're going to have some level of endurance. And this is where mistake number one comes in, and that is simply trying to replicate the sport, which actually fails to sufficiently overload the qualities that underpin the ability to punch harder and for longer. On the right hand side of this presentation, you'll see the energy breakdown of a 6-second sprint. Now, unsurprisingly, a 6-second sprint, a highly explosive activity, just like, for example, a 1-2 left hook. You'll see that 6% of the energy of a 6-second sprint is from the aerobic system. If you're not familiar with energy systems and how they relate to boxing, then I'd recommend checking out my video, The Sweet Science of Boxing Energy Systems, or indeed everything you need to know about conditioning, which is available on my Patreon. Now, 31% of the energy came from anaerobic glycolysis, with 54% of the energy coming from the phosphocreatine system. To put this into layman's terms, I would liken, or have likened, the phosphocreatine system to a match. So it produces energy or fire, whatever you want to call it, very, very quickly. So it's great for rapid explosive movements. The problem with the match is it's gone very quickly. On the flip side, the anaerobic glycolytic system, this is the energy system you use between 10 and 30 second near maximal activities. So this is what I would call a boxer's stoppage system. If you've got an opponent pinned up against the ropes and you need to put them away with a barrage of punches, then this is the energy system that's going to help you do it. Finally, the aerobic system I would liken to wood. So it takes a long while to light it, but once it is lit, then it's a sustainable energy resource. The anaerobic glycolytic system, or indeed the stoppage system as I've just referred to it, is probably more like newspaper. Burns slightly longer than that match that we just spoke about. It's still going to be near maximal intensity, but it's not quite as sustainable as the aerobic system, or indeed lighting some wood. The reason why replicating the sport, so for example just simply doing 12 3-minute rounds, doesn't sufficiently overload the physiology, is because if we compare that to an athletics event, if Usain Bolt wants to get faster, he needs to run at his near maximum speed capabilities. If you start sending Usain Bolt for a 3-mile run, the speed of his 3 miles compared to the speed of his 100 meters is absolutely miles away. And yet many boxing coaches do the equivalent in trying to get their boxers faster, and they send them for a 5k run. Again, a boxer or high-level boxer will knock out a pretty decent pace for that, but your pace of your 5-mile run might be, I don't know, you might be doing a 6-minute mile, which is still bloody impressive. So that'd be going at 10 miles an hour. Whereas equally, you might do, for example, a 400-meter effort in 60 seconds. So that, when you extrapolate it out to a mile speed, if you could somehow maintain that pace, would be a 4-minute mile. So you've ran 50% slower, and yet you're expecting your boxer to get faster. We'll break down the numbers a little bit more, but this brings me on to my next point, in that whilst a 6-second sprint only uses 6% of the aerobic system, so that sustainable energy system. When we start to back the sprints up, this is when the aerobic system starts to contribute more. So it's not enough just to be fast for boxing. We need to be developing boxers who have the ability to be repeatedly explosive. And what's going to help us do this is as a foundation of the aerobic system. If you look at the right hand side, you'll notice that sprint number 1 of this study was less than 10% aerobic, yet in sprint number 5 it's nearly 40%. Again, this is still only a 6-second sprint, and yet we're already tapping into other energy system resources. So a key underlying factor of this whole presentation will be you need to build a quality before you train to endure it. So many boxers or so many coaches are doing things the wrong way around. They're doing conditioning stuff with minimal, if any, rest. I remember in my boxing days, a classic conditioning circuit at the end would be something called a ton-up. So you'd have 10 different exercises where you do 10 reps of the first one, 10 reps of the second one, third one, fourth one, and so on. Once you got to the 10th one, then whatever rest period was left from the 2-minute work period, and then you'd have a minute rest. Whatever's left of that minute rest is what you get to rest. So if you've got someone who's smashing it, completes it in 2 minutes, they get the 1-minute rest interval. For the unfit people, so for example me, when I returned after a break from boxing during university, it was taking me 3 minutes to do the circuit, and yet this was somehow seen as a good thing because I was not as fit as obviously the fitter boxers, and yet I was in that grey man middle zone of intensity where, yeah, it felt horrible, but in terms of the maximal speed I was capable of, it was miles off. But why is repeated sprint ability, or indeed the physical qualities that underpin it, important for boxing? Well, firstly, it's going to predict the frequency of explosive efforts. A good repeated sprint ability is described as a high average sprint performance. So it's no good, for example, if you're a footballer having a high max speed but then dying off a cliff after the first minute. Equally, there's no point being a boxer, unless of course you can definitely get rid of someone in one round. No point being really explosive for the first round and then dropping off a cliff when it comes to the second and third round. So we want a boxer who can perform a high average explosive output with a low fatigue index. So a fatigue index being, for example, how explosive would you be in the first round compared to the last? If there's a huge drop off, then you're exposing yourself to a greater chance of losing. And equally, from a tactical perspective, if you can't impose your punch power on your opponent, or fatigue is starting to interfere with your ability to make decisions, it's going to make for a much harder task. Interestingly, players who had the worst scores on tests of their repeated sprint ability also covered less distance, or the least distance, in Premier League football matches, which suggests that repeated sprint ability is a key quality to not only covering more distance, but to being involved in these high intensity actions. Similarly, I'd like to think that a greater recovery between explosive bouts is going to predict a greater punch output. I put a question mark here because to my knowledge, no one to date has looked at this within boxing, but bearing in mind that the energy systems are going to be similar in the sense of there's going to be high explosive efforts, there's going to be recovery between these efforts, and you want to make sure the quality of these efforts when you're fatigued are as high as they possibly can be. So this brings us on to the question of how do we improve repeated sprint ability? So the inability to reproduce performance across sprint repetitions is going to be manifested obviously by a decline in sprint speed. Likewise, in boxing, an inability to sustain a high level of what you consider a high level of punch output, or indeed the force behind the punches, is going to be reflective of a boxer who struggles with repeated sprint ability. So the first thing we can do is get fast in the first place. So you cannot endure a quality you have not yet built. So if you want to develop the ability to repeatedly sprint or be repeatedly explosive, you need to be explosive in the first place. So this is going to look like sprint training with full recovery, which I'll get onto in a second, Strength training, because strength times speed is going to give you your power, yet so few boxers work on the strength aspects of this. We're going to need the ability to buffer hydrogen ions. So whenever you exercise at a near maximal intensity, so near your top level speed, you're going to produce hydrogen ions as a waste product. Now, a lot of people think that it's lactate that is the bad guy, but I'll get onto that in a second. But it's actually hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions are they're going to make your blood more acidic, which is then going to interfere with force production. I won't dive too much into the rabbit hole of why that is, but in simple terms, the more acidic your blood is, the less force or less power you're going to be able to produce. And in order to reduce the amount of hydrogen ions in your system, you have two options. Either A, you don't work as hard, which doesn't really make sense from a boxing perspective, but does explain why, for example, you'll see boxers take a couple of rounds off. So, for example, Anthony Joshua credited one of his wins credited his win over Vladimir Klitschko. He says he mentally told himself after being dropped, I believe it was in the 5th round or whenever it was, that he was going to take the next couple of rounds off. Now, from a tactical perspective, if you've got the technical ability to do this and not get caught, then brilliant. But for me, from a physiological perspective, it's also nice to not have to pursue that option of reducing your punch output if you can afford not to. So obviously a big component of this is going to be how powerful your aerobic system is. So if we use another analogy, your anaerobic energy systems are kind of like your overdraft, especially if we talk about that stoppage system or the anaerobic glycolytic system. So this is near maximal intensity activities that occur between roughly 20 to 30 seconds, and obviously that's going to produce a lot of hydrogen ions as a waste product as a result of that unsustainable intensity. Now, an overdraft is going to be something that bails you out of emergency situations. So it's nice to have a big one should you need it. However, a more sustainable way, or something you're going to need to bail you out from the overdraft or to repay that oxygen debt, if you will, is going to be being able to manage money, being able to manage money, and being able to keep a decent level of money coming in. So if you've got a really good ability to take in oxygen, so you've got a high VO2 max, this is going to help you not only repay that oxygen debt, i.e. The unsustainable resources you accumulated when you're exercising at near maximal intensity, but it's also going to help buffer those hydrogen ions that would produce. Now, typically, if you've got a bigger salary, banks will often let you have a higher overdraft because obviously they are confident in your ability to repay what you've borrowed. Similarly, if we talk about the body's physiological systems, the better an aerobic system you've got, then the better your ability to repay any oxygen debt you accumulate. So strength training and sprint training is effectively building our overdraft. Aerobic training is effectively building our salary or our ability to manage money. So the first part of improving repeated sprint ability, this is something you'll hear me say throughout this presentation: you cannot endure a quality you have not built. Yeah, I see so many boxing coaches doing what I would call these middleman intensity circuit types activities. This is stuff that feels pretty nasty, pretty grim, but in reality, if we look at the actual intensity, it's much lower than what we would get, for example, if we sprinted as far as we could in 20 to 30 seconds. 30 seconds, you might be covering, say, 200 meters of distance. And if I gave you a 5-minute recovery, maybe you can cover, I don't know, 190 meters. If I said you got 30 seconds to go as far as you can, and then in 30 more seconds, you're going as far as you can again, that 200 might drop to 175. You might do it again, it drops to 150. And all of a sudden, are you really improving your ability to go faster? Or are you just trying to hang on and survive the workout rather than actually get anything from it? Next, we need to talk about getting explosive in the first place. So I would recommend being able to work with a strength coach who's going to help you get stronger in the main lifts, because that's going to improve your ability to produce force. A lot of boxers say, oh, I don't want to strength train, I want to get bulky. But if you're doing the compound lifts in the low rep ranges, so 3 to 5-ish, and you've got full recovery, so 3 to 5 minutes, then you're not really going to be ticking off the correct stimuli for hypertrophy or for muscle building. If you want to actually find out how to pack on muscle, check out my science versus the bro science video, which talks about the underlying mechanisms of adding muscle mass. Now, if your rest is long, you don't really produce a sufficient level of the hormones required to put on muscle, and by keeping the reps low, we don't really accumulate enough damage to pack on the muscle. Equally, with boxers, the reality is they're doing so much conditioning work. If you imagine, for example, you're doing, I don't know, 6 to 10 conditioning sessions a week and 1 to 2 strength sessions a week, realistically, if 80% of your training is conditioning based and 20% is strength based, your body's probably going to adapt to the conditioning base. If we imagine a kind of Stretch Armstrong scenario where we're doing, for example, an equal amount of strength and equal amount of conditioning, we're still going to be probably in a net, we're still going to be at that equilibrium, if you will. Now, it's funny because since I've stopped boxing and I've strength trained for the past 7 or 8 years, I've not really put on that much muscle mass. Of course, I've put on some, but the reality is I've not got more muscular because I've started strength training per se. It's because I've stopped doing everything else. The one signal I've been given to my body is you're going to lift weights on a regular basis. You need to adapt to that. Whereas boxers, they're not lifting weights regularly enough to cause increases in muscle mass, unless, of course, they've dropped out all of their conditioning, which is a conflicting signal to the body. They started upping their calories significantly, which a lot of boxers don't do because they're firstly ill-informed about nutrition and often undernourished anyway, and they're not going to be able to perform the lifts heavy enough or frequently enough to stimulate hypertrophy. The next point to bear in mind is getting faster. A lot of boxers train with insufficient recovery all the time, which means they never actually get to improve their maximal speed. A good rule of thumb is a 1 minute recovery for every 10 meters covered when we're trying to push the ceiling of how fast we can actually go. I'll explain how we bleed that into looking more physiologically like a fight when I get to the sample program at the end of the presentation. So as I said, you can't endure a quality you have not built. This is why I actually don't think it's a bad idea for a boxer to spend time with an athletics coach to teach them the technical way of running properly. By improving your technique in sprints, especially if you're off season or you've not got competing demands with boxing, you are then going to run faster. You are going to put a greater stress on the heart and lungs, which is going to allow your body to adapt to a greater intensity, which is then going to give you your body the ability to perform at a higher intensity when you're in the ring. We mentioned earlier about how you can't just recreate the sport and hope this will give you the best adaptations, and this is because, for example, the intensity of sprinting is the most intense activity the body can do. You're using more muscles than, for example, boxing. You're using a greater intensity because you're asking the body to move as quickly as it possibly can, and there's also the plyometric contribution of asking the body to deal with multiple times body weights when you're sprinting down the track. So in the first phase of the sample program that I'm going to explain to you, you would be doing plyometric activities, so activities that involve a rebounding nature. So stuff like skipping is great if you're bringing the toes up to the nose. Stuff like low-level hurdle jumps are great. All of this plyometric work is going to condition the ankles and develop the elasticity of the tendons. Now, tendons are great to develop stiffness and strength in because, like an elastic band, when you develop the stiffness of the tendon, it's like pulling an elastic band and letting it go. It's free energy stored, recoiled, and springs back to provide you an elastic return. This is much more efficient than using muscular effort, and this is one of the reasons why even in elite longer distance runners, that strength to body weight ratio and ankle stiffness are well correlated to 5k and 10k running times. Of course, these runners are incredibly fit, otherwise they wouldn't be on the world stage, but high VO2 max, or the ability to utilize oxygen per kilo of body weight, is also going to be derived from how efficient you can run, which is also derived from, for example, how springy you are as an athlete, how much elastic recoil you've got coming back from the tendon, and how strong you are relative to body weight. The lighter your body feels for you, the easier it is to shift it around the track, and the easier it's going to be to shift it around the ring. So we're going to use multi-joint movements, such as a box squat or a trap bar deadlift. This is going to develop the strength in our legs and our ability to produce force, which, just like a punch, starts from the ground up. We're going to look at pure speed training with 1 minute recovery per 10 meters covered. And like I said, ideally this would be relatively early in the off season from a boxer's competitive season, because there's not much competing demands for their time. They can afford to be fresh coming into these strength sessions, and these speed sessions actually push their maximal force or maximal speed capabilities. And this is going to build a reserve, and then we can start training to endure speed. Then we can start training to endure power. But if we start trying to endure power, we're basically enduring a quality we might not yet have. Now, whilst it's not every boxer's aim to overwhelm their opponent with their punch output, it's nice to have the option if you need it. If you don't have the power to put your opponent away, or you don't have the ability to maintain a high enough near maximal intensity to force a stoppage, you're always going to be reliant on the decision. For me, the best boxers are those who always find a way to win, and in order to try and find different ways of winning, should the nature of the fight require it, you need as many tools in your toolbox as possible. Next thing we're going to look at is being able to enhance anaerobic power and capacity. Now, power is how much or how intense you can do something. So for example, Usain Bolt might be the most powerful athlete on the planet because he's also the fastest athlete on the planet. Capacity relates to how long you can do something for. So there's a reason why, for example, Usain Bolt's speed over 100 meters is quicker than, for example, Mo Farah's speed over a 5k or a 10k race, because obviously you're asking someone to perform for a longer duration. We need to train, once we've trained the ability to be explosive with stuff like box squats, trap bar deadlifts, short distance sprints, then we need to develop the ability to endure it. This is where we're going to be looking at more speed endurance type training, where we're lengthening out the distance of the sprints. The reason why I would start with the shorter distance sprints, so 10, building all the way up to say 40, 50, 60 meters, is because if you jump straight into, for example, sprinting as fast as you can for 30 seconds, one, you haven't built the skill, technique, or physical qualities to do that. Two, you're exposing the hamstrings to a high level of stress. If the hamstrings haven't been used to high speed running, then you're asking for problems. By training for anaerobic power and capacity, we, especially within the 20 to 30 second time duration, we are allowing, or we're exposing the body to high levels of lactate. Lactate is not the bad guy. A boxer who can produce high levels of lactate is one who is incredibly powerful. The issue comes when they don't have the appropriate aerobic system to buffer that lactate. Similarly, this would be the equivalent to, for example, someone who's got a massive overdraft but no salary to repay it, or a boxer who's incredibly explosive but doesn't have the aerobic energy system to help them back that up. So 20 to 30 second all-out intervals with long rest periods in between. Joe Wicks might tell you that you can do 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, but I'm telling you that is interval training. That is not high intensity. If I ask you to sprint as far as you can in 30 seconds, and I give you a 30-second rest, and I ask you to repeat it, your distance is going to go down and into the gutter, just like your speed is, just like your intensity is, and all of a sudden you're asking your body to adapt to a lower intensity, which makes no sense at all when we want to push our maximal intensity up. Now we move on to buffering capacity. So buffering capacity is the body's ability to take those hydrogen ions that are produced when you exercise at near maximal intensity and convert them or reduce them to lactate to use as a fuel source. This is done aerobically, so the better an aerobic system you've got, the more sustainable pace you can continue at. This is where it gets really interesting, because you'll notice from the graph, which is taken from David Bishop's research, and if you're interested in the references, drop me an email via platformtoperform@gmail.com and I will provide this for you. But they looked at different intensities from different studies, and they found that 80% of VO2 max seemed to be the sweet spot. At 90%, buffering capacity wasn't improved to the same extent, and at 100% VO2 max, it actually got worse. The best way you can find or you can put yourself in the ballpark for these intensities, if you don't have access to a sports science lab, is to run a 1 mile as quickly as you can, record the time, calculate your speed in meters per second, and then you can extrapolate this speed into distances. So for example, if you worked out that your meters per second speed is 5 meters per second, then by timesing that by 0.8, so that would leave you with 4 meters per second. There's your 80% VO2 max speed. In the sample program that I'm about to explain, we do 2 minutes on, 1 minute off at 80% VO2 max with a 1 minute recovery, because this has been shown to improve buffering capacity, or put another way, this has been shown to be optimal for improving your recoverability in higher intensity efforts. So higher intensity doesn't always equal better. So if we're looking at buffering capacity, lactate isn't necessarily the bad guy, because high lactate values are indicative of more powerful boxers. However, in order to use this lactate as a fuel source, or should I say, in order to use the hydrogen ions, convert them to lactate, and then use lactate as the fuel source, 80% seems to be the sweet spot. Now, for my dissertation, I was taking blood lactate values from amateur boxers. Those who posted higher values also had better knockout ratios, again indicative of a powerful anaerobic system. This also brings us nicely onto something known as critical speed. Now, critical speed is the highest intensity that you can operate at whilst being predominantly aerobic, so your highest sustainable pace. Now, this is similar to lactate threshold. When you go over your lactate threshold, you start to accumulate these hydrogen ions, which act as waste products and act to interfere with muscle force production if you don't have a sufficient aerobic base to use or to get rid of these hydrogen ions. Now, in the graph you're looking at here, let's suppose that the average intensity of the fight takes place at the orange line. Boxer 1 doesn't have as well a developed aerobic system, so is using non-sustainable fuel sources to come up to the average intensity. In comparison, Boxer 2 has a large aerobic system, so if we think about that salary analogy, and they're living within their means or living within their energy means, they're coming down to the average intensity of the fight. What this means is Boxer 1's force output is going to be compromised. They're going to find themselves either punching less to try and bring that intensity down, or they're going to find themselves not punching as hard, so that where the intensity of their punching is such that they can sustain either that pace or that frequency. But either way, it's bad news for Boxer 1, because they are basically on a time limit in terms of their punch frequency or their punch power. So lactate isn't the bad guy, the hydrogen ions are. The better aerobic system a boxer has, then the better their ability to recover between rounds and between high intensity activities. Interestingly, when I was with GB Boxing, they used the relationship between a 1K time and a 3K time, I can go over that even in a different video if you're interested. Then just drop me a comment below. But with critical speed, it seems to be that you need to gently try and nudge it rather than trying to smash it with a sledgehammer. Critical speed, or for example, your buffering capacity or your recoverability, doesn't tend to respond as well to those higher intensities, as we discussed in previous slides, as it does to gradually nudging up the volume and keeping that intensity at 80% VO2 max. Research from my dissertation also showed that it's not necessarily the boxers with the highest VO2 max that succeed, but rather those who are able to sustain a relatively high percentage of an already high VO2 max that seem to be more successful. Now, as I said, lactate isn't the bad guy, because you need to be able to produce high levels of lactate, because that's indicative of either high punch output or a athlete who's incredibly powerful. What we do need to bear in mind, however, is the balancing act between producing hydrogen ions from high intensity activity and being able to buffer or recover from the high production of these these hydrogen ions. So when we make an athlete stronger or more powerful, this also needs to be balanced with the buffering capacity work that I've mentioned previously. Now, if 80% seems to be the sweet spot for improving recoverability, does this mean we abandon high intensity training altogether? No. Now, the reason for that is threefold. Firstly, in order to get fast, we need to train fast. So therefore, we need to be sprinting at near maximal speeds, which means we need to have sufficient recovery between reps and between sets. Secondly, if our maximal intensity is up here and the pace of the fight is down here, then it gives us a buffer. This buffer, in fancy terms, is described as the anaerobic speed reserve. So the difference between your maximal speed and the speed at which you're fighting at. Secondly, for improving VO2 max, so the maximum amount of oxygen your body can utilize per kilo of body weight, then it's been found that intensities of 100% VO2 max, or for example the speed at which the average speed at which you're running your best mile time, that seems running at or slightly above that speed seems to nudge VO2 max up. If we also think about it if our VO2 max is here and 80% of our VO2 max, which is roughly our critical speed, is here, by nudging up our VO2 max, all of a sudden what was 80% now feels, relatively speaking, like 70%. And finally, we also need to improve blood lactate tolerance. The only way we can do this is by exposing the body to higher levels of blood lactate. So to do that, we need to be sprinting faster, or we need to be holding on to this speed for a longer duration. By operating at higher intensities, we seem to improve our ability to recover, because we can resynthesize phosphocreatine, which is that short-term energy store. We seem to enhance lactate threshold, which is the intensity. Once we go above lactate threshold, we start to accumulate lactate, we start to accumulate hydrogen ions, and that can be thought of as our sustainable threshold. We go above this, we're going to have to either drop intensity to become sustainable, or start dropping our punch output. So it's not that 80% is always better, it's not that higher intensity is always better, it's about knowing what physiological adaptation we're going for and the subsequent or the appropriate intensity to get that physiological adaptation. With respect to repeated sprint ability, repeated sprint training, or just proper speed training, whereby we're having that 1 minute recovery per 10 meters of sprint work done, has been shown to produce greater improvements in both the best sprint time and the average sprint time when compared to interval training. So if we're looking to improve our best speeds, speed training, repeated speed training is where it's at. However, it does appear that interval training can improve our VO2 max, which can then have a knock-on effect on our ability to recover between these high intensity efforts. So it's not that one type of training is superior to the other, but just you need to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and where it should come in your program. Therefore, we need a combination of speed training, repeated sprint training, and interval training to help us improve our maximal speed qualities and our ability to recover between these high intensity efforts, and the ability obviously to sustain this. So in phase one of this program, we're going to build those explosive qualities. We're going to get strong with those compound lifts, so stuff like trap bar deadlift, box squat, weighted pull-ups, bench press. These are going to build our force producing capabilities. We're also going to learn how to run technically well over shorter distances, gradually building this up whilst keeping as far away from fatigue as we can, because we want those high force outputs. We're also going to introduce the buffering capacity work with 2 minutes on, 1 minute off at 8% VO2 max. So we've got high intensity but a low volume with the sprints and with our lifts. And we are going to gently nudge up the volume over time on the buffering capacity work, which is still 80% VO2 max. So that's not really super maximal, but it's just gently nudging up our recoverability systems. In phase two, we're going to lengthen out the sprint. So we've built the ability to sprint fast over, for example, 20 to 40, 50, 60 meters. And then we're going to just lengthen that out somewhat, so that we're able to go towards those 20 to 30 second all-out efforts, which is going to improve our ability to produce lactate and our ability to tolerate lactate. We're also going to introduce a higher aerobic stimulus by breaking up those 2 minute intervals into sections. So in phase one, we're predominantly using 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. After 3 or 4 weeks, we've probably got most of our adaptation from this. So then we're going to start breaking up those 2 minute intervals into chunks. So it might be something like 6 efforts of 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off. So it's still 2 minutes of work, but obviously by 20-second chunks, we're going to get a higher intensity compared to a 2 minute chunk. And finally, in phase three, that's when our power training is going to take over, because power equals strength times speed. We've built a basis of strength with our strength training in phase one. We've built a foundation of speed with our pure speed training in phase one. And now we're going to try and marry them up somewhat. Now, when I say power training and strength training, it doesn't mean that that's all you're doing, or it doesn't mean there's no power training in phase one, or there's no strength training in phase three, but just that's where our predominant emphasis is going to be. For sake of trying to keep this video shorter, I've not given example strength and power sessions. Happy to do that in another video. Just drop a comment below or reach out to me via platformtoperform@gmail.com, and I can get to work on this for you. Finally, in phase three, we're looking at repeated speed. So this is where we've still got a relatively high recovery, but it's not a full recovery. So you're still operating with some level of fatigue. It's going to be a high aerobic stimulus, because you're asking the body to sprint maximally, but there's not quite the full recovery that you had in phase one. Also, we're going to be, as I said, building up those distances. So now, can we sprint for 30 seconds, and how quickly can we recover from that? So let's look at what this looks like put together in a program. So you'll notice that the distances of the sprints start relatively low and build up. You'll notice that the volume of the 2 minutes on, 1 minute off at 8% starts relatively low and then builds up. And with the strength training, again, I'd be bringing up the intensity of the lifts as well. I've missed out weeks 4, 8, and 12, as I'd assume these to be deload weeks. As a good rule of thumb, I would just cut the volume of the previous week in half. So for example, if this is weeks 1, 2, and 3, then week 4 for the 2 minutes on, 1 minute off might be 3 reps of 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. Equally for the sprint stuff, rather than doing 4 sets of 50 meters, you might do 2 sets of 50 meters. In phase 2, we're starting to develop the ability to endure speed. So now we've got, for example, a 2 minute rest period, which will slowly come down. We've got a walking recovery between reps. So each repetition, you're trying to hang on to the speed that you have created. We're also using strength and power training in conjunction with each other. We've built a reasonable amount of strength. We might be looking at strength speed exercises such as heavy trap bar jumps. We might be looking at speed strength exercises with medicine ball throws, or light trap bar jumps, or light squat jumps. Again, it entirely depends on the profile of the athlete, so I'm going to avoid going into too much detail on this video alone. Realistically, with the 2 minutes on, 1 minute off at 8%, I'd probably cap that at around about 12 reps. You're looking at about 24 minutes of work there, or half an hour session in total. You're going much higher than this, you probably don't get any extra physiological adaptation or benefits, and you might start to increase injury risk too. So that is where that is how far I would go with those 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. In the final phase of this program, this is where power training would probably be my option of choice. We can still maintain some strength if we feel like we need to, but we've also now built a foundation of speed. We've lengthened the distances out, so now when you're trying your 30-second max distances, you should be covering greater distances than what you otherwise would have done had you started here. You should be recovering more quickly compared to if you just started here, and this is going to allow you to overload the physiological systems better. When I have tried to compete in 400 meters myself, when I've started with this stuff, I found that even 5 minutes rest wasn't sufficient. I was still blowing out my arse after 8 minutes. So that's why you need to build a foundation of conditioning your hamstrings to higher speed work. That's why you need the buffering capacity type work to help your recoverability. If you jump into too intense a session too soon, then actually the sessions take too long because you take too long to recover, and your first rep is anaerobic because you've got the intensity there, and then you die of death and you're trying to hang on, but the intensity isn't really pushing your physiological ceiling any higher. In summary, build explosive qualities, then train to endure them. If you're going straight into repeated speed sessions, but you've not conditioned your hamstrings to sprinting, or you've not conditioned your heart and lungs to recover your force output in between high intensity efforts, you're kind of missing the boat a little bit. You need to decide what adaptation you're going for and choose your intensity appropriately. For example, if we want to improve recoverability, which is going to help us recover on the stool between rounds, then we need to go 80% VO2 max. 2 minutes on, 1 minute off seems to work nicely. On the flip side, if you're aiming to improve your maximal speed capabilities and you're working at anything less than 95% of your top speed, not an appropriate enough intensity to achieve your desired adaptation. Now, there is also not one single training modality that will improve repeated sprint ability in of itself. We need explosive training, which is going to be heavy strength training, so around 80 to 90% one repetition maximum. We need sprint training, which is pure speed training, which allows full recovery between repetitions, so 1 minute rest per 10 meters covered early in our training program. We need to expose boxers to what it feels like to be working in those nasty lactate conditions, so 20 to 30 second all-out efforts. But then we also need to give them sufficient recovery between these reps so that firstly they can produce these high levels of lactate, and then secondly they can actually tolerate them. There are many ways to skin a cat, not just the sample program that I've provided. If you do have any questions, then feel free to reach out to me via Todd Davidson P2P Coaching on Instagram, or Todd Davidson P2P on Twitter. If you've enjoyed this content, then feel free to check a look at my recommended resource lists, which includes Alex Viada's Hybrid Athlete, Dr. Alan Ruddock's Simple High Intensity Interval Training Handbook, and Joel Jameson's Ultimate MMA Conditioning. If you enjoy physiological research as much as I do and how it can improve sports performance, then check out David Bishop's Repeated Sprint Ability Part 2 for more information on where the references for this presentation came. If you're left with any questions, then you can reach me via the following methods. If you've enjoyed this video, then like it, share it with a coach, an athlete, or a friend that you feel might benefit from it. And if you'd like to recommend more content, then subscribe to my Patreon via www.patreon.com/Todd Davidson P2P Coaching. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you again in the next video.